Greetings, fellow researchers. This is a brief video that will outline the essentials of the research process. First and most generally, there are simply three steps in the research process. The first is to pose some kind of question that's of interest to you, collect some data that will answer that question, and then present the answer to that question to an audience who is concerned to find the answer to the question that you researched. We'll be referring often to this slide that gives you a broad overview of all the steps in the research process. Everything from identifying the research problem, reviewing the literature related to that topic, specifying a purpose for the research effort, collecting data, analyzing and interpreting that data, and then reporting and evaluating the research. That first step, identifying the research problem, involves first discovering some issue or problem that needs to be solved. Obviously, there are a lot of issues in the world that are worthy of interest, or that are interesting and worthy of some consideration, but the important first step is for the researcher to identify for him or herself what that issue is and why it needs to be solved. When we go ahead and start writing your paper, you need to state this up front so that the person who might be interested knows right from the beginning what the problem is and why you are interested in studying it. So for us right now in this class, it's important at the very beginning to start thinking about that topic and what it is that you'll be studying for the rest of this semester. The next step is to conduct a literature review. And literature review basically helps you discover what has been studied about this problem before and what do the people who studied it think. And this is a crucial first step in the process for an individual to become literally immersed in the literature of that particular topic of interest to them. This does a couple things. One, it gives you a broad view of what has been thought about this topic, but also exposes you to not only the solutions that some people have come up to that problem, but also helps you look at a situation with greater clarity. If you have a better idea of what other people thought, there might be some things that you never even considered before, that when you finally do see what other people have thought about it, opens up a whole new level of perspective and insight into the issue that you're talking about in the situation in which you work. What are the sources for a lit review? Well, you can find summary statements and books, but most of all, you find the answers, or you find the information for these in journals and index publications. We often call these peer-reviewed journal articles, and here's where most of the information resides. When we write the literature review, what you do is you don't cite everything that you've read, but you selectively choose the literature that you're going to include, and you summarize that literature in a written document. In this case, you summarize it in the lit review section of your research project. The next step is to then state the purpose for doing this particular research. Once you've done the lit review, you may discover, really there's no more need for a study. The study has already been conducted. I'm just going to use what already is out there to address the problem that I face. Or you may find there's a gap in the information, and that's really what you need to do, is you need to be able to find out what is missing and fill that missing intellectual hole, or apply it in a unique situation that you face. In essence, what you're saying is you state what you intend to do with the findings once you've discovered them. Next thing you do is you collect the data. You identify individuals for study. This is often called sampling the population group, the individuals from the entire population that you wish to single out for study or to talk to about gaining more information. You obtain permission from the site that you're working and from the individuals that you're going to be working with. And then oftentimes you gather that information by asking questions or observing behavior. The next step is to analyze and interpret that data. This is where you draw conclusions from whatever data that you've drawn, and then you represent that finding in charts or graphs if you're doing a quantitative analysis. pictures, other kinds of descriptions if you're doing qualitative, and then you've explained what you found. The next step is to go ahead and report this information. You decide on the audience, you structure the report for their viewing. You present the report, and then you submit it to some standard evaluation. This could be a self-standard that you look at and you say, did I meet all the criteria? Or you can submit it to an independent body. We call this the peer review process, where you actually go ahead and have others who are experts in the field make a judgment about the quality of your work. Now, there are basically two different kinds of research that we conduct in educational research: quantitative and qualitative approaches. The quantitative approach is for the number folks, where you convert your observations into some kind of data to be able to manipulate in some way, a t-test or an ANOVA, a correlation or a regression, some way to reduce the observations into a number. The second way is of conducting research is to do a qualitative study, which is basically where you go about doing interviews or observations. You don't reduce things to number, but you organize and find themes common to the people that you are interviewing or the situations that you observe, and you present it in some form of a narrative. A little more about quantitative research methodology. Basically, it's the approach of scientific method to the social sciences. Same methods that you would use in a lab, we're going to be using in the lab of personal experience. It has somewhat of a modernistic philosophical foundation. By that we mean that the world is orderly and understandable, and that we can perform tests on it, and from those tests understand something about reality, especially in terms of predicting what is or what can happen in the future. And just as atoms and molecules are subject to predictable laws and axioms, so is human behavior also subject to similar kinds of laws that we can understand and use to predict what is going to happen in the future. So people who believe in quantitative research methodology believe that the world is objective and reality is understandable. Standing somewhat on the other side of that are the emphasis of quantitative research is collecting information and reducing it to some kind of a number or some kind of object expression of it. And so we collect scores and we measure attributes, and then we take those numbers and attributes and then we compare either group to group or factor to factor, variable to variable. So we want to find the relationship between the groups of numbers on one side and the groups of numbers on the other side. So we assume in quantitative research that the future can be predicted by the past, that people are part of the natural order of things, and our behavior can be understood, and from that we can make assumptions about how people act. And one of the most controversial parts of quantitative research methodology is that behavior is normally distributed. That means that you can find an average person, and know that there are people that will be above average and people that will be below average, and that there could be a norm that you could use to predict generally what a group of people will be able to do. The qualitative research methodologist is more of a postmodernist philosophical foundation, and believes that ultimately that knowledge is personally constructed. You construct a view of the world that is different than anybody else who constructs that view of the world, and through that view of the world you look at your world and surroundings. You have a lens, you have a bias that is inescapable, and because of that there is no such thing as a objective reality that can be understood by all people equally. In this methodology, the researcher is more passive. They need to listen to the view of the participants, get their story, get their perspective of things. We need to ask these kind of questions of people that we interview and let them talk. not bias their response or frame their response too much in advance, and that we go into the reporting of our research with an understanding that we have bias, and that bias will affect how we view things. It will affect how we report things. And if as long as we're up front, we're okay because we're not pretending that things will be otherwise. Qualitative research assumes that life is not neat and orderly. As I mentioned, there's no such thing as objectivity, although we can try to be as objective as we can, but we won't ultimately be able to achieve that. And that once we have come to terms with our own understanding, we've constructed reality for ourselves, then we submit our views to a larger body. And then as a group, we construct our understanding of a field, and what I add to it is necessary, but also what's necessary is what others would add to it as well. Finally, for this brief introduction, we're going to talk again somewhat briefly about ethics. The important parts of the research process involves all the things that you would just intuitively think. We need to be honest about what we find and what we discover and what we report. We need to understand that we have biases, but be as objective as we can. We need to do the work. If we're going to interview, we interview enough people and make sure those interviews last as long as they need to last. If we do a survey, we need to do it honestly and not try and bias the responses. We need to be careful and conscientious in what we do. If we find what other people think and say, we need to reference that, and we report other people's observations. We're not going to steal other people's ideas. We need to be confidential in what we find out. Sometimes we can discover things that could get somebody in trouble. So when we report things, we need to make sure that we protect people's confidentiality and guard that, and make sure that we don't report things that could lead to serious repercussions for other folks. And we need to have respect for other human beings and the processes that we're putting them through. I've listed two videos on that we play in class, and you can access either one of those through YouTube. One's the Milgram Obedience Experiment. The other is the Stanford Prisoner Studies. I'd suggest that you go on YouTube and Google either, or search for either of those, and take the 10 or 15 minutes necessary to watch one or the other. And basically what it does is shows what happens when researchers aren't concerned for what might happen to the subjects of a study. In both cases, good information was gathered from the study, but at a significant cost to the participants, and in both cases some damage that was done. And because of that, we have what's now called institutional review boards, which review studies and make sure that any study doesn't harm the human subjects that will be participants in the study. And again, I would suggest that you go take a look at either of those. And on YouTube has nice little documentaries on both of those. So then that's it as a brief introduction to research methodology. We'll be talking about all these topics in much more detail throughout the course, but this will help you get a broad overview of how we're going to proceed.